Whenever you pick up a Bible, have you ever just stopped and wondered, how did all of this get here? I mean, who decided which books made the cut and which ones didn't? It looks like one single massive book, right? But its history, well, it's a lot more like someone trying to assemble an entire library. So let's just dive right in and figure out how the Bible actually got its table of contents.
Right, let's start with that huge question right there. If the Bible really is a library, a collection of dozens of documents written over hundreds and hundreds of years, then who got to be the head librarian? Who had the final say to go, yep, this one's in, nope, that one's out? Answering this question is pretty much the whole point of our quest today. And to get there, we first need to get familiar with one very specific, very important word.
And that word is canon. Now, it comes from the Greek word canon, which literally means a measuring rod, a standard. And no, we're not talking about the kind of cannon that goes boom on a pirate ship. Think of it more like a ruler or a standard that books were measured against to see if they were considered divinely inspired and, authoritative.
So when we talk about the biblical canon, what we're really talking about is that official, accepted list of books that make up the Bible. But this list didn't just appear overnight. It was a long journey, a process of recognition, a lot of debate, and finally, confirmation. And this brings us to a really crucial point about how the people involved saw this whole thing. This quote right here, it gets to the absolute heart of the matter. See, the early church leaders in the councils, they didn't think they were making these books holy. Not at all. They saw their job as simply recognizing the authority that was already there, inherent in the writings themselves. It's a small difference in wording, but a huge difference in meaning. They were just authenticators, not the ones who created the authority. Okay, let's start with the first section of this library.
The Old Testament, or what's also known as the Hebrew Scriptures, has a really fascinating backstory of its own. The foundation for what Christians call the Old Testament, well, it was already pretty much set in stone long before the New Testament was even a thing.
By the time of Jesus, the Hebrew Bible was already organized into this neat threefold division. You had the Law, which you might know as the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Then you had the Prophets, which included history books like Joshua and Kings. And finally, you had the Writings, which is where you find beautiful poetry like Psalms and wisdom books like Proverbs. This structure was super common, widely accepted, and even gets referenced in the New Testament itself. But even with all that agreement, it's still not perfectly simple. So, today, if you compare a Protestant Bible and a Catholic Bible, you'll spot a key difference. The Protestant Old Testament has 39 books, which lines up with the Hebrew Bible. The Roman Catholic Old Testament, on the other hand, has 46. So what's up with those extra 7 books? Well, they're known as the Apocrypha. They were included in the Catholic canon, but Protestants didn't recognize them as having that same level of divine authority. Okay, now let's jump over to the New Testament, because that's where things get even more complex.
Yeah. The formation of the New Testament canon, it's a whole different story. All of a sudden, the early Christian community was dealing with this flood of new writings about Jesus, his life, his teachings, and they desperately needed a way to sort the reliable from the, well, not so reliable.
So why the big rush? What created this urgency? A few things, really. First, you had heretical teachers, like a guy named Marcion, who started creating their own edited Bibles, literally cutting out the parts they didn't like. Ouch. Second, as Christianity grew, so did the attacks from the outside, with critics questioning the core texts. And finally, just on a practical level, churches needed a standard, recognized collection of books that everyone could agree on to read during their services. All this pressure basically forced the church to get organized and formally define its sacred texts.
And believe me, this did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process that unfolded over centuries. Around AD 170, we see an early list called the Muratorian Canon, and it already had most of the books we know today. Then, in AD 303, something intense happened. The Emperor Diocletian ordered all the sacred Christian books to be burned. And that persecution, ironically, helped solidify the canon because it forced communities to decide which books they were literally willing to die for. It wasn't until AD 367 that Athanasius of Alexandria wrote a letter with the first list that matches our current 27-book New Testament exactly. And then finally, in AD 397, the Council of Carthage gave it a formal stamp of approval.
All right, this is the part I think we've all been waiting for. We know when it happened, but how did it happen? What was the investigator's toolkit that the early church used to put these books to the test?
Because, let's be clear, the church leaders didn't just get in a room and pick their personal favorites.
They applied a whole series of pretty rigorous tests to see if a book truly measured up to that standard of canon. So what were they looking for exactly?
It basically came down to these 4 main tests. First up, apostolicity. Was it written by an apostle or someone directly connected to one? For instance, the Gospel of Mark was accepted because everyone knew Mark was a close associate of the Apostle Peter. Second, acceptance. Was this book already being used and read by churches all over the place? This was like a grassroots consensus. Third, content. Did the message line up with the core Christian faith that had already been passed down? This is how other texts, like the so-called Gospel of Peter, got rejected. And finally, inspiration. Did the text just have that undeniable, self-evident quality of divine authority? Did it feel spiritually powerful?
So, as we start to wrap up our quest here, the picture that emerges is, well, it's not a secret backroom meeting where a few powerful guys made a final decision. It was much more organic and much more incredible than that.
And this brings us right back to that crucial distinction we talked about earlier, and this phrase sums it up perfectly. The canon is a list of authoritative books, not an authoritative list of books. Just let that sink in for a second. The authority didn't come from the list. It wasn't granted by the councils. The authority was believed to be already in the books themselves. The list was simply the church saying, hey, we recognize this. In other words, the books made the canon didn't make the books.
So, if you take away one thing, let it be this. The Bible's table of contents was formed through a slow, organic, widespread consensus. It was a process of reception and recognition that happened in the Christian community over hundreds of years, all guided by a pretty clear set of criteria for what they were looking for.
And that leaves us with one last thing to chew on. If this whole process was about recognizing an authority that was already there, instead of creating authority, how does that change the way you view the Bible, or maybe even other ancient texts? It suggests that real authority doesn't come from a committee's decision, but from a text's own inherent power and its influence on a community across generations. Definitely something to think about.